Welcome back to Council Bluffs. Today, presented by Waldstein Plumbing, I'm Todd Studer. And today, we're not going to talk about Council Bluffs. We're going to talk about our neighbors to the west. No, not Omaha. You know, if you've lived anywhere in the Omaha Council Bluffs metro for more than a few months, you already know the basic story of what we're going to talk about today. You know that Carter Lake is an Iowa town trapped on the Nebraska side of the river. You've likely made that drive out to Epley Airfield. You look out the window, you see an Iowa police cruiser rolling down what you thought would be North Omaha's streets. It's one of those classic pieces of local trivia that we all love to talk about to outsiders. We point to the map, laugh about the time the Missouri River went rogue in 1877, left a chunk of Iowa stranded. But most people only know the surface highlights. They know what happened, but they don't always look at the operational reality of how people actually survived in that borderland for the last 150 years. Because once the river moved, the real story began. It's a narrative of bureaucratic abandonment, a local tax revolt that nearly changed the state map, a mid-century casino era that tested the absolute limits of law enforcement, and a modern tribal gaming expansion that is actively funding the town's infrastructure today in 2026. So today, on Council Bluffs today, we're going to move past the standard trivia. We're looking at the actual mechanics of the ultimate border anomaly. So let's see what happens when a community gets cut off by the water and forced to make its own rules. We all know the river changed its course during a spring thaw in March of 1877, but to understand the legal wars that followed, we have to look closely at the exact mechanics of that shift. So, before engineers built modern flood walls and dams, the Missouri River was wide, it was shallow, and incredibly unstable. And quite often, it rewrote its own banks, but usually it just did it slowly, inch by inch through standard erosion. The problem was a massive, exaggerated horseshoe loop north of downtown known to old steamboat captains as Saratoga Bend. The land inside that loop, East Omaha Island, was physically connected to the Iowa side, and you could walk right into Council Bluffs from there without crossing the water. But during that March thaw, millions of tons of winter ice, floated down the river, jammed into the narrow neck of Saratoga Bend, and the river backed up rapidly, filling the floodplain and putting immense hydraulic pressure on that narrow neck of land. On one specific night, the water didn't just overflow. It cut completely through the earth. It bypassed the entire horseshoe loop, carving out a brand new, straight channel 1.25 miles to the southeast. By sunrise, the main flow of the Missouri River was running down a completely different path. That old Saratoga Bend had become a stagnant oxbow lake, which locals called Cutoff Lake. The land itself hadn't moved an inch, but its relationship to the water was inverted. The river that used to sit to its west was now flowing to its east, and overnight, the residents found themselves physically cut off from the rest of Iowa and pinned directly against the growing city limits of Omaha. And that sudden shift is exactly what triggered a decades-long legal war over who actually owned the ground. So almost immediately, a major property dispute erupted. The city of Omaha and the state of Nebraska looked across that old dry riverbed and saw a clear opportunity to expand their industrial footprint. So back then, there was a newspaper called the Omaha Bee, and they began running regular articles and making the argument that since the Missouri River was the official boundary between the states, and since the river now ran east of the island, the territory automatically belonged to Nebraska. Nebraska developers began buying up plots, and Omaha law enforcement officers started patrolling the area, and they were just kind of treating it as their own. Council Bluffs and the state of Iowa, well, they had different ideas, and they counter-argued that a state's sovereign borders cannot be rewritten overnight by a random spring flood. They maintained that the land was still Iowa property, and its residents were still Iowa citizens. So this left local property owners in a state of total legal confusion. They didn't know which state to pay taxes to or which laws applied to their property. If a crime occurred on the island, local officials They didn't agree on whether the suspect belonged in a Nebraska jail or in an Iowa court. The dispute grew so complex, raising significant constitutional questions about state sovereignty, that local courts they just refused to touch it. The case bypassed standard tracks and went straight to the highest court in the nation, the United States Supreme Court. So, when the case of Nebraska versus Iowa was argued before the Supreme Court in 1892, the justices weren't just solving a local boundary issue. They had to establish a definitive framework for how moving bodies of water affect borders all across the United States. So, to do this, they turned to English common law and international water doctrines, and that formalized two distinct legal concepts that still govern property law today. The first concept is accretion and erosion. The court ruled that if a river shifts its course slowly and just almost imperceptibly over decades, and gradually washing away dirt from one bank and depositing it on the other, the state boundary moves along with the water. It's a slow motion migration of the border. But the court also established a definitive exception to the second concept, and it's called avulsion. The justices ruled that if a river suddenly and visibly abandons its old bed to cut a brand new channel during a sudden flood event, the state boundary does not move. The border remains permanently anchored right in the center of the old abandoned dry riverbed. So let's look directly at that unanimous opinion of the court that was delivered in 1892. So here's what the Supreme Court justices said. Accretion, no matter which side it favors, updates the boundary. But when a stream, which forms the boundary between two states, suddenly abandons its old bed and seeks a new one, such change of channel works no change of boundary, and the boundary remains as it was, in the center of the old channel, although no water may be flowing therein. Therein is their word. I don't actually use that. So applying that rule to our metro map, the decision was a complete victory for Iowa. The Supreme Court ruled that the flood of March 1877 was an undeniable act of avulsion, and it was sudden and it was instantaneous. Therefore, the official boundary line between Iowa and Nebraska did not move an inch to the east, and it remained pinned precisely where it was before the flood, looping right through the middle of Cutoff Lake. So Iowa had won the legal battle. The Supreme Court had spoken. Carter Lake was officially an independent piece of Iowa territory. But winning that legal title was the easy part. Then the real mess started when the lawyers went home, because neither the state of Iowa nor the city of Council Bluffs had any functional plan on how to actually govern an island trapped on the other side of the river. So put yourself in the shoes of a Carter Lake resident back in the 1920s. The Supreme Court says you are an Iowan, but practically speaking, you're just completely on your own. By this time, the community had grown into a distinct blue-collar neighborhood. Families were building homes. Businesses were opening up along the lakeside, but they were living in an administrative blind spot because they were technically within the municipal boundaries of Council Bluffs. The city sent them a tax bill every year. By 1926, the residents of Carter Lake were collectively pumping about $25,000 annually into Council Bluffs' budget. In the 1920s, that was quite a bit of money. And what did Carter Lake get in return for those taxes? Yeah, practically nothing, because there was no bridge connecting Council Bluffs directly to Carter Lake. Our city couldn't realistically provide municipal services. If a house caught fire on the island, the Council Bluffs Fire Department had to drive across town, cross an Omaha bridge, navigate Nebraska traffic, and by the time they got there, the structure was usually gone. So as a result, Carter Lake had no local fire protection, no municipal water lines, no public sewer system. If a crime happened, Pottawatomie County deputies had to execute a multi-state road trip just to write a report. Now, to make matters worse, Council Bluffs refused to build a high school on the island, and that meant local kids could only go to school up to 8th grade unless their parents paid out-of-pocket tuition to send them across the state line into Nebraska schools. So, the residents were experiencing classic taxation without representation, and by 1927, they had had enough. Council Bluffs today is brought to you by Keith Jones, your Edward Jones financial advisor in Council Bluffs. Learn how he can help you reach your financial goals. Visit edwardjones.com for more. Edward Jones, member SIPC. If you're looking for a laid-back spot with great food and even better company, it's the Mile Away on Old Lincoln Highway north of Council Bluffs. This family-run bar and grill is your go-to for mouth-watering wings, unbeatable weekly specials, and a welcoming atmosphere that feels like home. So, if you're catching a game, enjoying one of those specials, or just unwinding after a long day, the Mile Away has you covered. Open every day, Tuesday through Sunday at 8 for breakfast, and don't forget them at lunch and dinner time as well. It's the Mile Away, Old Lincoln Highway, north of Council Bluffs. That year, local leaders organized a formal political revolt. They held an emergency town meeting, voted overwhelmingly to execute a political secession, explicitly declaring that they were severing all ties with Council Bluffs and the state of Iowa. A local attorney, his name was W.C. Frazier, he became the public voice of the movement, and here's what he told the press. God took us out of Council Bluffs when the good old Missouri cut us off. We are a cut-off territory, cut off for all purposes except paying taxes. So, armed with their vote, the leaders of the rebellion marched across the state line into downtown Omaha, and they formally petitioned the city of Omaha and the Nebraska legislature to annex them. They argued that since they were already physically attached to the city, shopped in Omaha stores, worked in Omaha factories, Nebraska should just take the land and accept the taxes. And it seemed like an easy land grab for Omaha. But the city engineers sat down with the numbers and then they hit the brakes because at the time, Carter Lake had zero infrastructure. So to annex the territory, Omaha would be legally obligated to spend thousands of dollars digging up roads to lay water mains, connect sewer lines, extend electricity grids, and build public services from scratch. Omaha city leaders looked at the cost, looked at that modest tax base on the island, and gave those secessionists a definitive no. Even the Omaha papers ran op-eds warning against the annexation, pointing out that Carter Lake was already starting to develop a slightly unregulated reputation. In Omaha, they didn't want the financial liability. So you look at the isolation of Carter Lake at this moment, and Council Bluffs was taking their money but not giving them any services. Omaha, right next door, and they're not letting them in. So they're completely stranded in a geopolitical no man's land. But instead of folding, the people of Carter Lake decided to use that isolation to their advantage. They realized that if neither state wanted to govern them, it meant nobody's actually watching them. So in 1930, they officially voted to incorporate as an independent, self-governing entity the city of Carter Lake, Iowa. They formed their own city council, hired a one-man police force, and set up a system that was designed to exploit their unique geography, turning their detached island into an unregulated entertainment and vice hub for the entire metro area. So, moving into the 1930s in Carter Lake, Iowa, while the rest of the country was navigating the Great Depression and strict local regulations, Carter Lake was operating by its own rules because of the geographic layout. Local law enforcement, basically, they're paralyzed. Omaha police had no legal jurisdiction to make an arrest on Iowa ground. And if the Pottawatomie County Sheriff in Council Bluffs wanted to mount a raid, word of the operation had to travel across the river, and that meant local lookouts in Carter Lake usually had about a 30-minute head start, while the sheriff's cruisers navigated Omaha traffic to get to the island. So entrepreneurs, bootleggers, and underground syndicates, they recognized right away that this structural blind spot was a perfect sanctuary. The first major boom came from Prohibition. That was when Prohibition went away, because when that happened, states rolled out repeal laws at wildly different speeds. The state of Iowa legalized the sale of hard liquor and beer a whole lot faster and with fewer restrictions than the more conservative legislature at the time in Nebraska. So Carter Lake businessmen quickly set up large liquor warehouses right on the edge of the state line, just yards away from Nebraska. Every weekend, thousands of Nebraskans would stream across Locust Street, buy up crates of liquor in Iowa territory, drive right back into Omaha. Carter Lake was essentially functioning as a massive liquor pipeline right in Omaha's backyard. But liquor was just the start. The real money was at high-stakes gambling. So by the late 1930s and through the 1940s, Carter Lake transformed into a regional gambling destination. Underground syndicates built luxurious casinos along the lake. They weren't dingy backroom poker games. These were high-end nightclubs. They featured jazz orchestras, fine dining, crystal chandeliers, and rooms packed with roulette wheels and craps tables and slot machines. And the crown jewel of the era was the Chez Prairie, located right on Locust Street. The Chez Prairie was an opulent casino that became known as one of the largest and most profitable gambling operations anywhere in the country between Chicago and Nevada. On any given night, prominent businessmen and politicians from Omaha, Kansas City, and even Chicago would park their cars outside, step through the doors, and gamble under the nose of the law. Stories from this time, they showed just how unusual the dynamic was. Several of the bars and clubs were built directly on top of the winding, irregular borderline between Iowa and Nebraska. So inside of these establishments, operators placed their gambling tables on heavy industrial wheels. So listen to this. If a lookout spotted an infrequent surprise raid by Iowa State investigators, the pit bosses, they would just yell out a code word, and dealers and players would grab the edges of the tables and physically push them a few feet across the room, and that rolled them over a painted line on the floor onto the Nebraska side of the building. By the time the Iowa officers come through the front door, gambling, it's technically happening in Nebraska. And that made the Iowa warrants useless. So if Nebraska cops showed up, they rolled the tables right back into Iowa. Just a shell game that was being played across state lines. This open era generated significant revenue, but it also cemented Carter Lake's reputation kind of as a rough, lawless pocket of the world. The party finally came to a hard close in 1949 when a newly elected, reform-minded Iowa governor named William S. Beardsley, he took office and declared war on illegal gambling. He bypassed local county authorities and dispatched a coordinated convoy of Iowa State Highway Patrol troopers across the river, and they executed a massive, simultaneous raid that just smashed the slot machines, padlocked the doors of the Chez Prairie, and permanently closed the Grand Casino era on the island. The neon lights went dark, and the operators packed up for Las Vegas. But the daily anomalies of living on an island state border, well, those were still there. As the metro area shifted into the late 20th century, the daily reality of living in Carter Lake became a series of unusual bureaucratic workarounds. So take the postal system. Because the United States Postal Service operates on efficiency rather than historical Supreme Court cases, they didn't want to send an Iowa mail truck across the river just for one small pocket of homes. So the USPS assigned Carter Lake an Omaha zip code, 68110. If you live in Carter Lake today, your driver's license says Iowa, you pay income taxes to Des Moines, and you vote for the Iowa governor, but your mailing address reads Omaha, Nebraska. So up until the late 1990s, the phone companies operated exactly the same way. Carter Lake was hooked up to Nebraska telephone prefixes. If a resident living in Carter Lake wanted to call her child's school administration office or check on a property record at the county courthouse in Council Bluffs, the phone company classified it as a multi-state connection and charged her long-distance rates just to call her own county seat. Are you looking for something to do close to home? Go Local Iowa brings Southwest Iowa events together in one place, from live music and fundraisers to festivals, family activities, and community celebrations. It's also a place to discover local businesses and support the people who keep our communities moving. Before you make your weekend plans, check golocaliowa.org. Go Local Iowa. Find what's happening right here at home. Technology should work for you, not against you. At ThinkSpace IT, they provide expert IT solutions to keep your business running smoothly and securely. From cybersecurity and cloud services to network management and tech support, they simplify IT so you can focus on what matters most. Stay protected, stay connected, stay ahead. Visit ThinkSpaceIT.com. And then there's the famous geographical sandwich of the airport commute. You take a taxi from Council Bluffs to Omaha's airport, you cross the river out of Council Bluffs into Nebraska, drive down the highway, enter the city limits of Carter Lake to re-enter Iowa, then leave Carter Lake to enter Omaha again, right before hitting the terminal parking garage. But if you think the legal drama of Carter Lake died out with the old casinos in the 1940s, history repeated itself really not that long ago in a major way, triggering a brand new sovereign border war that went all the way back to the federal courts. In the early 2000s, the Ponca tribe of Nebraska, a federally recognized Native American tribe, acquired a modest 5-acre plot of land inside the city limits of Carter Lake. For years, the plot was used for tribal member services and medical clinics. But behind the scenes, the tribe's leadership executed what was a pretty smart legal strategy based directly on the town's unique geography. So under federal law, specifically the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, federally recognized tribes can operate gaming facilities on sovereign tribal trust lands. But here was the catch. The state of Nebraska had a long-standing, strict constitutional ban against casino gambling. The Ponca tribe, they couldn't open a casino on their lands in Omaha or Lincoln without facing an immediate state shutdown. Carter Lake, it's not Nebraska, it's Iowa. And Iowa laws do allow for regulated casino gaming. So in 2018, the Ponca tribe successfully petitioned federal regulatory agencies, and they opened the Prairie Flower Casino right on their 5-acre plot in Carter Lake. The political reaction across the metro was immediate. The state of Nebraska, city of Omaha, and even the state of Iowa banded together, filed a large federal lawsuit to shut that casino down. Omaha city leaders were frustrated, pointing out that a high-traffic casino was operating physically inside the urban ring of Omaha using Omaha access roads, but paying absolutely zero taxes to the city of Omaha. Nebraska officials argued that a casino physically attached to their state line completely undermined their local gambling laws. But the Ponca tribe and the city of Carter Lake fought back in court. Carter Lake's local leadership supported the tribe, pointing out that the casino was bringing economic vitality to an area that's been structurally ignored for decades. And the courts agreed with the tribe because Carter Lake is legally, historically Iowa soil, and because federal tribal laws took precedence. The Prairie Flower Casino won the legal battle. So if you want to see how fast that momentum is moving, you only have to look at what's happened over the last year. So just recently, the Ponca tribe officially wrapped up a large 70,000 square foot expansion of the Prairie Flower Casino. They shifted from a modest slot machine parlor into a comprehensive gaming resort floor. We're talking over 600 slot machines, live-action table games, an upscale sports bar lined with large television walls, and a major food and beverage footprint that has brought over 175 permanent jobs to that island community. And the impact on the local community of Carter Lake has been highly visible. The gaming tax revenue flowing directly from the Prairie Flower Casino has pumped over $4.5 million directly into Carter Lake's municipal budget. So for a small city that just kind of felt abandoned by its own county seat in the 1920s, that money is a game changer. Carter Lake just officially opened a brand new community center, a project the town's been trying to fund for decades but never could afford. They use the funds to bolster their public safety, expanding their local police force with new cruisers, hiring dedicated officers, and purchasing advanced rescue equipment for their volunteer fire department. What started as a frozen flood in March 1877 created a geographic anomaly that spent a century fighting for survival, identity, and respect. And today, Carter Lake stands not as a forgotten pocket of land, but as an independent, thriving, and economically viable player in our metropolitan landscape. Kind of makes you think about how our geography shapes who we are. Carter Lake is just a microcosm of the spirit we all have across southwest Iowa, resilient, resourceful, and completely unafraid to carve out their own path when the river shifts underneath their feet. So next time you're driving out to Epley or next time you're checking out the new lights of the Prairie Flower Casino floor, take a look at the ground beneath your tires and remember the ice jam of 1877. Remember the Supreme Court justices of 1892, and remember that rowdy poker tables on rollers at the Chez Paris. You're driving through history. So this episode was produced by the team here at Les Hills Medium Podcast. If you loved this deep dive into our local history, please do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. Leave us a review. Share this episode with a neighbor and drop a comment on our page. Tell us your thoughts. And as always, support local. And we'll see you next time right here on Council Bluffs Today, presented by Waldstein Plumbing. My name's Todd Studer. Have a great day.